If you caught my last video on the Ashes of Creation lawsuit, you know we spent a lot of time on secured debt. Specifically, how much of that roughly $84 million claim against Intrepid Studios is actually secured, why that number matters for how strong a credit bid TFE could make in another foreclosure, and why Judge Linda Lopez ordering an independent review of that debt could turn out to be a big deal. I still think all of that matters, but a handful of new filings have me looking at this case from a completely different angle. Because while everyone's been fixated on who ends up controlling Intrepid's assets, I think we also need to start asking who controls Intrepid's debt. And maybe more importantly, whether Steven Sharif is even going to keep the shares that let him bring some of these claims on Intrepid's behalf in the first place. There are three threads I want to tie together here. CommerceWest Bank's secured position has been transferred to a company called Dawnfire. TFE is about to subpoena CommerceWest for what looks like basically its entire Intrepid loan file. And Aaron Bartels, one of the defendants in Steven's federal lawsuit, part of the TFE defendant group, is asking a Nevada court to hand him Steven Sharif's 10% ownership stake in Intrepid Studios. On their own, each of these has a reasonable explanation. Put them together though, and there's a much bigger question staring at us. Are Dawson and the people around TFE moving past just defending themselves in Steven's lawsuit and starting to go after the very positions that let Steven keep fighting it? Let's start with the shares. Aaron Bartels filed suit against Steven Sharif in Nevada, and the debt at the center of it actually goes back to 2021. According to the complaint and the documents Bartels has now filed, he loaned Steven's brother Tim Sharif $4 million. Steven personally guaranteed that loan, but he also did something else. He pledged his ownership in Intrepid Studios as collateral. The pledge agreement spells out exactly what that collateral is. Steven Sharif's common stock in Intrepid Studios, 10% of the company. The loan was supposed to be paid back by September 2023. Bartels now alleges Tim hasn't repaid any of the principal, and that Steven hasn't made good on his guarantee either. If that's all this lawsuit was, it'd be a fairly ordinary debt collection case. But it isn't. Bartels is asking the court for three things: an order forcing Steven to actually hand over the collateral, an injunction blocking him from selling or moving it anywhere else, and ultimately possession of the shares themselves. The pledge agreement itself is where it gets more interesting. It says that after an event of default, Steven can lose the voting rights tied to those shares. Bartels was also given a stock power and irrevocable proxy as part of the deal. So this wasn't Steven casually tossing his Intrepid shares and his collateral. There's a genuinely detailed legal mechanism here for Bartels to take control of those shares if the loan is in default, and the agreement holds up. Now, tie that back to Steven's federal lawsuit against Dawson and TFE. Steven isn't suing only in his individual capacity. Look at the caption on the federal case: Steven Sharif as an individual and derivatively on behalf of Intrepid Studios. A shareholder derivative lawsuit is basically a shareholder stepping in to pursue a claim that actually belongs to the company, on the theory that Intrepid itself has been harmed, but the people currently running Intrepid aren't going to sue themselves. So Steven is trying to bring some of those claims on Intrepid's behalf as a shareholder. Here's the catch. To bring a derivative claim, you generally have to hang on to the ownership stake that gives you standing to represent the company in the first place, which is exactly why this Nevada case could end up mattering a lot more than a fight over $4 million. If Bartels wins and Steven loses all his Intrepid shares, the defendants in the federal case could try to argue Steven no longer has standing to pursue the derivative half of that lawsuit. I want to be careful here. That doesn't mean Steven automatically loses the whole federal case if Bartels ends up with the shares. He still has individual claims of his own, and there's real legal argument to be had about how and why someone lost their ownership stake, and whether the derivative claims can survive that anyway. No judge has ruled that Bartels getting these shares would end Steven's derivative claims outright. But losing his ownership stake in Intrepid could absolutely set up a serious standing fight. Now, here's where it loops back to the secured debt story from the last time. CommerceWest Bank made a $6 million loan to Intrepid back in December 2020, and it came with a UCC security interest covering a huge swath of Intrepid's property: equipment, accounts, cash, general intangibles, intellectual property, Basically, the kind of filing you'd expect from a lender trying to lock down most of the company's assets. CommerceWest mattered to our last discussion because that filing dates back to 2020, which potentially put it ahead of later secured creditors. Then on August 3rd, something changed. CommerceWest filed a UCC amendment assigning that secured party position to Dawnfire LLC. I need to draw a clear line here. The public UCC filing proves CommerceWest assigned its position under that financing statement to Dawnfire. It does not by itself tell us what Dawnfire paid, how the underlying $6 million loan actually changed hands, or who funded the transaction. So I'm not going to sit here and say Dawson bought CommerceWest's loan, because the document we have doesn't prove that. What it does prove is that CommerceWest is no longer the secured party on this UCC position. Dawnfire is. Importantly, there are connections between Dawnfire's physical address and people in the Dawson TFE orbit, which is exactly why this assignment is worth watching closely. Think about what it means for the last video's discussion. One thing that could complicate a future TFE foreclosure is another senior secured creditor sitting ahead of them. An independent bank in that position could have completely different interests than TFE does. But if that position instead lands with an entity connected to people inside this litigation, the whole creditor landscape potentially shifts. Then, on August 19th, we get another filing. The TFE defendants gave notice they intend to subpoena CommerceWest Bank. That group includes Robert Dawson, Ryan Ogden, Teresa Fett, Aaron Bartels, and TFE Games Holdings. And they're asking for basically the entire file cabinet on this loan. The loan and security agreements, the UCC filings, payment and default records, CommerceWest's internal underwriting and risk assessments, financial info from Intrepid and from John Moore, and any documents on a sale, assignment, or transfer of the loan itself. Now line up the timeline. July 14th, Bartels sues for Steven's shares. August 3rd, CommerceWest UCC position gets assigned to Dawnfire. August 19th, Bartels files the actual loan, guarantee, and pledge documents showing Steven's 10% Intrepid stake as collateral. And on that same day, the TFE defendants file notice that they intend to subpoena CommerceWest for the complete history of the loan, including any sale or assignment. That's not proof of some secret coordinated plan. Nothing in these filings says, here's our strategy to strip Steven Sharif of standing. And there are perfectly normal explanations for all three of these moves individually. Bartels says he's owed $4 million. That hasn't been repaid. If Steven really did pledge this stock and the loan's in default, a lender going after its collateral isn't unusual. Dawnfire picking up a distressed secured position could just be a financial transaction. And TFE issuing a subpoena to CommerceWest makes total sense in a case where everyone's fighting over how much debt Intrepid has, which debt is secured, and who's got priority. But I think we'd be missing something if we didn't look at the combined effect. On one front, the independent CommerceWest secured position appears to have moved over to Dawnfire. On another, a member of the TFE defendant group is trying to take Steven's ownership in Intrepid. On a third, TFE is trying to get the complete third-party bank record of Intrepid's entire loan history. If all three of those land the way they're aimed, the balance of power here looks very different. TFE gets a much clearer picture of the senior debt against Intrepid. The CommerceWest position is no longer controlled by CommerceWest. Bartels potentially owns Steven's 10%, and Steven ends up facing a fresh fight over whether he still has standing to pursue the claims on Intrepid's behalf at all. That's why I think the legal strategy in this case might be expanding. Up to now, most of the attention has gone to the foreclosure question. Who owns Ashes of Creation? How much secured debt TFE actually has? How big a credit bid they can make? Whether another foreclosure is even on the table. Those questions still matter, but I think we need to add three more. Who controls Intrepid's senior debt? Who ends up owning Steven Sharif shares? And if Steven stops being an Intrepid shareholder, what happens to the claims he's currently bringing on the company's behalf? The answers to those could end up being just as important as whatever the independent review decides about the $84 million secured debt figure. Because there are two ways to win a lawsuit. You convince the judge the other side is wrong, or, in some situations, You attack whether the other side even has the right to bring the claim at all. We don't know yet if that's what we're watching here, but after these filings, I think it's a possibility worth taking seriously. And the documents that could give us the clearest answer are probably the ones CommerceWest is about to be asked to hand over. I appreciate y'all watching, and thank you for kind of hanging out with me through this whole process. It certainly is interesting and educational to follow, and that's what we'll keep doing. So as we learn more, I'll keep putting videos out. In the meantime, I'll see you in the next one.